r/Nosleep. Posted by u/Guardian_. I'm never going for a midnight walk again. I live in the southern US and something happened to me about a week ago that, for the first time in my entire life, truly terrified me. For one, my story does not deal with the paranormal or anything wildly unexplainable for that matter. In fact, I don't doubt that there exists a reasonable, rational explanation behind what happened. Likewise, I still don't subscribe to anything superstitious or supernatural, but I figured I could find some closure in sharing my story. For context, I'm a fairly fit male in my early 20s and I recently moved back home after finishing college and encountering difficulty in attempting to find a job during the pandemic. My family has lived in the same neighborhood for around 12 years now and it's not the nicest place by any means. The best way of describing it would be a collection of about 6 streets right off of a highway. State-wise, it's about halfway between a well-kept, regulated subdivision and truly rural territory. More specifically, there are trailers, houses that have been there for 30+ years, houses that are currently being built, a couple empty lots, and a fair amount of forest between the more populated sections of the subdivision. There are only a few streetlights strewn about and they're dim at best. The place is an HOA's worst nightmare, now that I think about it. To keep myself healthy, I usually go for walks or runs around the neighborhood, depending on how sore my legs are. Given the lack of school and work, I've been a bit of a night owl recently. Due to the late nights and unbearable heat, my walks almost always take place after sundown, sometimes well after midnight. This was one of those occasions. My grandmother was out of town visiting family in Texas and my dad was doing work offshore, meaning I was the only one in the house. As such, I was sure to lock the door on my way out. To give an idea of the street layout I would be walking on, picture an H. My house is on the southwest leg of the H, with the bottom ends of the H leading to the highway and the top ends of the H being dead ends. On this particular night, I was walking from my house towards the dead end of the street. As I walked, I approached a house that owns a couple of small dogs. The dogs are rarely out at night and even then, the owner had the entire front yard closed off with a thin wire fence. This was when I first noticed something strange. In the dim light, I could make out the silhouette of a large dog-like figure lumbering around the yard, doing what I could only assume to be sniffing its surroundings. I figured in that moment that the family owned another big dog that I was unaware of, and that they had put him outside for the night. It was far too dark to make out any details, but as I got a bit closer, it became quickly clear that this most certainly wasn't a dog. Its center of mass was far too low and not only it was crawling around fairly quickly, but its movements seemed so unnatural. It was almost as if I was looking at footage of an animal crawling around the lawn at 120% of its original playback speed. At this point I was unsettled, but still a bit curious. I approached some more and once I got within about 20 feet of the yard, it began moving away from me. I figured that it had seen me and wanted to put more distance between us, which reinforced my suspicion that it was more afraid of me than I was of it. Feeling slightly more at ease, I turned around and began to walk back towards my house. I tried convincing myself that it was a wild boar or an adolescent black bear, but I had encountered these animals before and the way this thing moved was so unlike anything I had ever seen. As I glanced behind me one last time, the thing was crouched at the very corner of the fence that was closest to me, staring in my direction. I got goosebumps instantly and sped up a little, reminding myself not to set foot near that yard again until the sun was up. Remember that the streets form an H. The house with the dogs was on the northwest, near the dead end of my street, and my house was on the southwest, closer to the highway. Rather than walking south and heading directly home, as I should have, I decided to take the connecting street and spend some time on the road that's parallel to mine, but a bit further east. After spending about 5 to 10 minutes walking up and down on that road instead of my own, the weird creature from the lawn had been replaced by other thoughts. Eventually, I figured it was time to conclude my walk. As such, I went west on the connecting street to get back to my own, and turned south, now only a few houses away from my home. That's when I saw it. The figure I had seen lumbering around in the fenced-off lawn down the street was now crawling around unnaturally in front of my driveway. I stopped dead in my tracks. My mind immediately fell back on black bears and feral swine and I tried convincing myself that I was braver than I actually was. I must have succeeded to some extent, because I didn't instantly haul ass in the other direction. There was a street light a little bit behind it, but it was still so dim that I wasn't able to make out anything other than the shape of its silhouette. At this point, I was a morbid mixture of afraid and curious. I desperately wanted to be inside, but at the same time, I desperately wanted to know what the goddamned thing was. It was at this point I did the most idiotic thing I could have. I approached it. It was crawling so oddly, smelling the road in front of my house over and over again. I was only inching towards it, mind, but I truly hoped it would back away like it did the first time I approached it. I was only 2 houses away when it spotted me. I stopped, waiting. At that moment, it was almost too dark to tell whether it was sitting still, backing away, or lurching toward me. I noticed for the first time that my heart was pounding. Any last bit of courage I had was exhausted at this point, and I began to step backwards, not taking my eyes off of it. Then 2 things happened. It reached out with one of its front legs in a seemingly impossible manner. Its left arm was extending out absurdly far while the remainder of its body remained completely still. The arm was so long and large I don't understand how it was able to do this without toppling over. As soon as it did this, I was enveloped by a harsh swelling noise. Breathe in sharply through your nose and imagine that sound, but everywhere. It wasn't even coming from the direction of the figure. As quickly as my reflexes would allow, I turned around, bolted back down the street, and didn't dare look back. I can swear I heard it shuffling towards me in the swelling, sucking like sound growing louder and louder every second. I wasn't about to let it corner me at the dead end, so I took a right turn on the connecting street and continued running. It wasn't until the noise died out and I was on the other road that I dared to look back. For a moment, I was afraid that I wouldn't see it, but I did. It was crouched at the other corner where I initially turned, staring at me just as it did from the corner of the wire fence. Afraid it would follow me if I stayed in its line of sight for too long, I crept south down the road. At this point, I contemplated taking a shortcut through a neighbor's lawn and making a break directly to my backyard, but the trees were too dense and that route would be even darker than taking the street. Instead, I opted for a safer route with more light. I walked all the way south to the highway, made my way west, and found myself at the entrance of my street, this time from the opposite side. I was 3 houses away, just like before, and I wanted nothing more than to be locked inside of my home. From where I was standing, I couldn't see any sign of the thing, so I started walking cautiously. I was especially careful as I got within 20 feet of my house, making sure to inspect the yard and behind my car and passing for the figure. My heart dropped when I realized I had no choice but to let my guard down in order to unlock my front door. With my hands shaking, I managed to get the key into both the knob and deadbolt, unlock the door, and shut myself inside. My pounding heart was more noticeable now than ever. I sat there in safety for at least 10 minutes before doing anything other than breathing. Not only was this my first truly terrifying experience, but much of the terror stems from how little I know about what this thing was. I wanted to peek through my window and see if it was still prowling the streets, but I had an irrational fear that its twisted, smiling face would be pressed against the glass. I vowed not to look outside again until daylight had returned. Shortly thereafter I decided to go wash the sweat from my face, when I noticed that blood was trickling from my right ear. Well, it had trickled, at least. All that remained now is a streak of maroon crust that trailed down the side of my face and tucked itself under the back end of my jaw. I wiped it off and used a Q-tip to clean out any remaining blood. To this day, I don't know how I slept that night. By the next afternoon, my friends and I had made jokes about gearing up and hunting down whatever it was that chased me. After those conversations, I had pretty much convinced myself that it was a black bear giving me a bluff charge, and that all of the terrifying and unexplainable factors of the whole situation were manufactured by my own mind. At ease, I went for another walk with the sun out to see if there were any prints or similar clues in the area. I didn't manage to find anything in front of my house, but it wasn't long before I noticed the police car down the road. My stomach dropped when I noticed that it was in front of the same house that I initially saw the figure. That day I learned 2 things. As for the family with the fenced-off yard, one of their small dogs was found the following morning with its organs strewn about the yard, some of them hanging up in the oak tree not far from the porch. It also turns out that their yard was not where I first saw the figure lumbering around. I initially spotted the thing in their neighbor's yard, which looks very similar, hence the confusion. That means when it was staring at me from the corner of the lawn, about 30 feet away, there was absolutely nothing separating the two of us as I strolled casually away. I'm never going for a midnight walk again.